Thanks very much. I'm George Abernathy, the proud president of FreightWaves, and I wanted to welcome you to this wonderful SpaceWaves Fireside Chat. SpaceWaves, you know, we at FreightWaves talk so much about, we really almost have the corner on the market of where the intersection is of logistics, supply chain, and transportation, and the use of capital, venture capital, private equity, and deployment of capital. And in space, it's really no different, and it's at a point now where I think it's going to be great to take advantage of somebody who's uniquely positioned and qualified to talk about these areas and topics. So let me introduce Brant Arseneau. Brant Arseneau is the founder and CEO of 9.8 Capital, and he's the founder of Space Ventures. Brant is a space and fintech entrepreneur, investor, board member, advisor, and capital markets expert. So, Brant, let's have some fun. Thanks for doing this.
Oh, it's my pleasure. In fact, when you say unique kind of perspective, it's very unique because I had the lucky chance to help Craig out in the early days of FreightWaves, and I had this guy call me and said, "Hey, I have this great idea about getting into the freight industry more on the technology side and thinking about futures and options and risk mitigation tools and information." And I said, "Oh, I love that. I think that's fantastic." So I helped Craig early on in his venture, and just so happy to see you guys do well. And I kind of had a feeling, hey, when are they going to call me when transportation overlaps with space? Because I knew I'd get that call someday. I just didn't expect it this year. I thought it might be next year or the following year. So I'm absolutely delighted to talk about that intersection.
Well, there's a number of us here at FreightWaves that are space nerds, space nicks, whatever, including Craig Fuller, Timothy Dooner, who we just heard from. We've got a lot of folks who can tell you the difference between Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, SpaceX, and going on. So let's talk about that intersection right now. And why don't we kick it off with, why don't you talk about Space Ventures, your investments, and how and what you do and how you do it?
Sure. And I think my story, there's all kinds of different stories in the space industry about how people got here and why they're here. But there is that common theme. I think most people are quite enthusiastic about it, and it's hard not to be. But I actually, when I was a kid, I wanted to be an astronaut. And growing up on the East Coast of Canada, you didn't have a lot of access to people that knew about how to do that or even encourage you, because they wanted you to be a lobster fisherman or a cod fisherman, which is a great way to earn a living. But I wanted to be an astronaut. So I ran into some family members that said, "Hey, you need to be a fighter pilot, test pilot in the United States, or you need a PhD." So I engineered my whole education around being an astronaut. So I went and did engineering. I got into neural networks. I went and did PhD research. I did neural networks. And when I came out of that, I applied to the Canadian Space Agency. Still have the rejection letter. So I have that framed, very nicely worded. They weren't hiring astronauts at the time, so I said, "Oh, I don't know what I'll do." So I went to school in Scotland, and I went down to London looking for a job after so many years in research, and I answered an advert for a job at the Bank of England using nonlinear stochastic algorithms and different mathematic techniques to calculate Basel I capital. And I said, "I don't know what Basel I capital is, but I know all the math." And I walked onto the trading floor in 1994 and loved it, absolutely loved it. So it was a good consolation prize for not being an astronaut. And being a good Canadian, I went kicking and screaming to New York City. They wanted to transfer me to New York. I said, "I can't go to New York. I like living in London." And about 3 days later, love New York, love JP Morgan, love everything that I'm doing there. And I've been there 30 years. So just loved it. And I got into a specialty of building trading systems and risk systems and markets. And that's how Craig and I got connected early on, which was quite delightful. And then I started seeing in my corporate job off to the side, Elon getting involved. That was great. But that was kind of a one-off. And then Sir Richard Branson got involved, and Jeff. And you saw some top-down capital formation of, wealthy people that can put money from the top down. And I thought that's interesting. maybe I'll do the same. It's simple, right? You do what Elon did or Jeff, make a $500 million and get into space and do whatever you want. That didn't exactly work out for me. Close. But I eventually ran into a very famous Canadian astronaut, Chris Hadfield, and started talking to him to get some advice about, hey, how do I make this transition from fintech to space? We had several conversations, and I boiled it down to two choices. One is jump into a space company and use my years of management experience on technology and engineering, or leverage my finance experience. And Chris didn't hesitate. He said, use your finance and business experience. The space industry is full of really brilliant technicians and engineers and thought leaders around the products of domain, but they don't have a lot of experience raising capital or running companies. And he said, you could really help with that. So I didn't know what I was going to do, but I had a chance to exit my last company, and I started a company called 9.8 Capital, which is an advisory firm helping space companies with their strategic matters, including raising capital. And then I got this great phone call from a young chap down in Florida saying, hey, I have a problem I really want to solve, and it's early stage funding for space companies. His name's Brant, and there was a set of laws brought in 2015 called the Jobs Act, which is Jumpstart Your Small Business Act, which allowed an amendment to the SEC rules of 1933, where the SEC put some things in place in 1933 to protect non-accredited investors. So investors that weren't considered sophisticated investors, we didn't want them to get hoodwinked or taken advantage of again, which a lot of people did during the Great Depression and years after that. So a lot of people feel it wasn't fair that the public can't invest in private equity, but it was put there to really protect them. I believe that. But over time, it just felt like the rich got richer, and the have-nots weren't allowed to invest in private equity, and they re-looked at it over the years and came up with this act, which allows non-accredited investor, which is the definition in the States is someone that makes less than $2,000 or has less than $1 million in assets. So the government really wants to protect that crowd of people, but they put new rules in that said, hey, we're going to allow you to do private equity, but we're going to put some limitations on based on your salary. We're going to calculate how much you can do. So Space Ventures is a new platform that's just being developed and being certified that is going to create the largest community of space investors in the world and list companies there for space investors to invest in. So that's the two companies that I'm involved in, and really, trying to look at that early stage capital formation. But there is challenges through the whole the capital chain in space. But I don't think it's idiosyncratic to space. I think it's just because space is a new industry, that you don't have the VCs well formed that you guys may know, like your Sequoias and your Bessemers and those funds. They're not really ready for space yet. Private equity isn't really ready for space. The investment horizon really in traditional VC funds are 7 to 10 years. In space, it could be 15 to 20. So the LP partners of the VCs, it's not a really good risk reward matching for them. So.
It's really interesting you talk about that. And actually, one of the interesting things you talk about is getting a rejection letter from a Canadian agency. There's no nicer people in the world than Canadians. So I can't imagine. That must just be the most nicely written rejection letter. So we'll have to talk about that at some point, or let me see that. But when you talk about the private equity firms, like you say, the ones that are sort of right at the tip of our fingers, tip of our tongue, do you expect over time, with so much capital that seems to be out there that needs to be deployed, that there will be a migration of some of those brand names into the private equity world around space, and particularly in the supply chain in space?
Absolutely. In fact, some of them are creeping in now. So the node, Kostla has a couple of investments. Bessemer has a couple of investments. Right. Sequoia has a couple of investments. One of the big ones is Steve Jurvetson from Future Fund. He has a lot of great investments. He was one of the first investors in both Tesla and SpaceX. You will see that part of the market, the mid-market VC market, very well serviced. And it's really about them understanding space and matching the liquidity points of the space companies with their LPs' expectation. The LPs, the limited partners, are expecting 7 to 10 years. And right now, companies, we haven't had a lot of exits in space yet. They're coming, but they're more like 10 to 15 years. So the VCs have two choices: to raise a fund with a longer horizon, or wait, what I call, for Space 2.0. So right now what's happening in space is kind of, if you go back to, which is not really hard to think about, go back to 1998 on the internet. And what was happening? It wasn't Priceline, or it wasn't Google, or it wasn't these big e-commerce platforms happening in 98. It was Corning, up in Corning, New York, was trying to figure out, how can I pull more glass? Cisco was trying to, how can I build routers that can route and do a lot of internet routing on fiber? So that was the infrastructure that allowed 2005 and e-commerce to happen. And I think that's what we're happening in space right now, is we're building the infrastructure. So satellites that can do computing, transportation, lowering the cost of access to orbit, which is happening through a lot of innovation from Elon and others. And communications, right? We have Artemis is a big program by NASA that are sending the first woman and the next man back to Mars. And that program is going to keep people there. We're going to need a really robust communication network between the moon and Earth. And then once we get to Mars, we're going to need that. So that infrastructure, once that infrastructure is in space, you'll start seeing things like asteroid mining and rare metals and things of that nature, that the economy of space, which right now is more things in space adding value to Earth, like Earth observation, detecting wildfires a year before they happen, detecting pollution, detecting a lot of things from satellites. The next wave of Space 2.0 will be an in-space economy, where you have two entities in space doing commerce with each other, with really no kind of connection to Earth, that other than maybe a product going back.
That's really fascinating, Brant. So for someone who, likes to pretend as if I'm a bit of a terrestrial supply chain expert, I'm really intrigued with how the supply chain in space will have some obvious differences, but things that I think you'd be able to address for folks like me who are addicted to the supply chain. How is the space supply chain so dramatically different from terrestrial?
Well, and I'm surprised that I didn't mention it in your last question. That's a big part of Space 1.0, is building up that supply chain. In fact, probably one of the most important aspects of it. The people that are exploring space right now, NASA and private companies like SpaceX, they're really good at exploration. They're really good at pushing the boundaries. What they really aren't good at is setting up those commercial operations of things that you need to just operate every day and get really good at it from an operational perspective, from lowering the risk, and from a cost perspective. And I think that's really where private industry comes in for supply chain. I think the only industry that the only entity that can do supply chain well will be private industry. And I think that's going to be very, very important. Now, being in space is going to be new for terrestrial transportation and freight companies, other than just zero gravity. I mean, things that, when you're moving something from New York to Cleveland, Cleveland's not moving, right? It stays in the same spot. But when you're moving things from Earth to the moon, it's relatively straightforward, but there is a lot of orbital mechanics and things of that nature that is much more complicated. But getting from freight from Earth to Mars is very complicated, and very sensitive to fuel and things of that nature. Not that it's not sensitive in terrestrial, but it is a whole new dynamics. But I suspect the names that you see in the freight and transportation industry, and you can see them on CNBC every day, you'll see a spaceship with some of those logos
Wow.
in the future. Absolutely.
So I'm so fascinated. We think about modes and modality being so complicated here. people who can talk truckload may or may not be able to comprehend all the different elements that LTL provides to us. And then you have intermodal, domestic intermodal, and they're like, but now we're talking about, as you said, literally a moving target. So you do think that we'll see some brand names, whether they're, J.B. Hunt or ArcBest or Schneider or FedEx, on those cargo rockets as they're making their way to their destination?
Absolutely. In fact, I'm surprised, in the science fiction, or not science fiction, but near fiction movies like The Martian, that you didn't see Maersk or US Express on the side of a ship going to Mars. You'll see that in popular culture very soon. And some of the things that you just mentioned are very, very big topics right now. And the space industry, I don't think, use lighter than load. But a ride share on SpaceX is really big, right? Because he can get two types of customers. One, Starlink, which is his other company, to take the whole capacity of a Falcon 9. But most of the time it's a ride share, right? It's lighter than load, and the economics are quite different. And that's what's allowing access to space for smaller companies. I know several companies that are doing small computing in space, and to get their small sat into space is like $40,000. You imagine in 1970 how much that would have cost?
That's extraordinary. Now, is that Canadian dollars or U.S. dollars? I'm sorry, that's a little bit of a shot, but that it is remarkable. So, in the number of companies, are there dozens, hundreds of thousands of companies that are working in this direction and trying to work in space?
A great question, and you're probably going to be surprised. So, Space Ventures, that's the platform for investing in private space companies. We also have a tool called SpaceBase, which is supposed to be the crunch space, which I'm sure you're familiar with, and a lot of your audience is familiar with, for space. So, and because we're industry specific, we add more value and more dimensions to space data. So it's really powerful. We now have 2,000 space companies in that database. Yeah, and things like. And things like what you would expect, like satellite companies. A lot of there's right now there's around 5,000 satellites in orbit. Believe it or not, only around 1,400 to 1,500 are operational. The other 3,500 ran out of fuel. Can you believe that? These are billion-dollar assets that ran out of fuel because back in the day, the idea was we're going to send the satellites with all the fuel they'll ever need. And when they run out, most likely the usefulness of that asset is gone. But what we're finding out is all those assets are orbiting the Earth right now. And if you had them operational, you would generate a lot of revenue. So there's this one individual entrepreneur that I'm a big fan. His name is Dan Faber, is going to put the first gas station in space, which is really related to your industry, right? I mean, I know fuel and power in the transportation industry is a big variable, a big thing to think about. So if you think about a gas station in space, now you can kind of change your missions, right? You, instead of launching Earth with all the fuel that you need to get to the moon, you could take less fuel, more cargo, more people, and stop for some gas in cislunar and maybe a hot dog and a Coke. So it really changes how you operate.
Wow, I just hope that I can get a big gulp when I'm out there in space, because it's a long way to the moon and really much even longer to Mars. So we haven't talked very much at all. We're talking about the private sector, obviously, but you're doing some things, with Congress to try to address and gain federal support, federal grants, and the like. Can you speak to that a little bit around the commercial space industry?
Yeah, if I step back for a second, when I decided to focus on the finance aspect of space, I kind of thought about what are the different parts of a financial system required to innovate and fund a whole industry, right? And you need early stage capital, you need mid stage capital, you're going to eventually need a bank that gives loans out. You're going to need a commodities exchange. You and I are going to be able to buy a future on moon water in 10 years, maybe 20 years. So there's all this infrastructure that's going to be built, and some of it will overlap with terrestrial capabilities. But one thing that's really needed we believe, is a development bank. a government-funded development bank, and there's several examples around the U.S. One is an export-import bank that is a development bank. The Tennessee Valley has a development bank. So what we really need is a development bank for space, and what we believe that will do is kind of take the volatility out of the transition from a government-funded industry or stimulated industry to a purely commercial industry.
So unfortunately, we're coming up on the clock here, but just one question. You're, again, uniquely qualified to answer this. How far in the distance are we from regularly scheduled, as you described, lighter than, less than truckload, being the norm rather than the exception? You know, when Bob and Doug went up, 6 or 7 months ago, the good news was the world came to a stop because we needed good news, and we just sent up another one, and the world was so interested. But eventually we'll be sending things up routinely. How long away are we from it being routine?
I think we're at the beginning of that. I think we're already there, but just at the very beginning. And I speak to a lot of colleagues in the space industry that like to say, hey, we want to make this part of space boring, and we're going to probably miss talking about it with so much excitement, but it's very close to around the corner. But if you think about who's doing this right now, Elon and SpaceX is really the major player that's putting lighter than load up there, making access to space for lots of small startup companies quite reasonable. But there's a couple of companies nipping at their heels, like Rocket Lab, like Astra, like Richard and Jeff Bezos, and then they're the ones that the names, and I say the names because the audience is going to know them. There's a raft of people behind them. So I think access to space, and there's a company called Axiom out of Los Angeles that is going to be the first private space station that you and I could get to. And what I mean by you and I mean there's been a couple of private space flights, and they cost 20, 30, 40 million. I think within our lifetime, you'll be able to go up there for, a million or two, even to the moon. And there's another great company that it's called Space Perspective, that's creating a high altitude suborbital balloon that I think our German friend jumped the highest parachute off of. And you could go in that capsule with a glass of champagne and have a trip for 6 hours and actually see a perspective of the Earth that isn't that unlike what you would see from the space station. So, and I'm told by some of my astronaut friends that view of the Earth is quite eye-opening. Right, you kind of look back at that one little place that we live. So I think that access to space is right around the corner. I think we're not even talking 5 years.
Wow, this is so great. I could go all day. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to bring this to a close. Brant Arseneau, founder, CEO of 9.8 Capital and founder of Space Ventures. This was truly fascinating. I really appreciate you doing this. Thank you, Brant, and be very well. Take good care and stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to be invited back next year.
Oh, count on it. Take care. Thanks a bunch. Be well, everyone. Thanks a bunch, and enjoy the rest of Space Waves, our virtual summit. Be well.